Hello, I'm Joshua Sparrow, Executive Director of the Brazelton Touchpoint Center, and this is Learning to Listen, Conversations for Change. Today, we'll be listening to Terry Cross and learning how to listen to children, families, and colleagues whose ways of knowing and ways of being may be very different from our own. Growing our understanding of the differences in Indigenous and Western thought can really help expand the humility, empathy, curiosity, and imagination that we need for the work we do with children and families and communities to gather and create knowledge together. We are incredibly fortunate to have Terry join us today, who brings to us his gift of opening eyes, ears, hearts, and minds. Over 2,500 people from around the country and the world have registered for today's webinar. So tell us who you are and where you're from in the chat. I've already seen people from California to South Carolina, from Wisconsin to Texas, and we're so glad that you're all here with us today. And also with us today is our wonderful interpreter, Maria Jose Gutierrez, who is joining us all the way from Bogota, Colombia, and she'll be simultaneously translating our webinar in Spanish. Thank you so much once again, Maria Jose. To access the translation, click on the interpretation icon in your Zoom controls. Then select Spanish. To mute the English in the background, you just need to select Mute Original Audio. La conversación de hoy será en español e inglés. En los controles de esta reunión, haga clic en Interpretación. Haga clic en el idioma que le gustaría escuchar. Para escuchar solo el español, haga clic en Silenciar Audio Original. And please do use the chat feature if you have a comment to share, or if you need help with a technical issue. You can also email Kayla Savelli with any technical problems, and you'll see her email address is posted in the chat. And look at your email tomorrow, because you should receive a thank you email from us with resources on Terry Cross's work and that of the National Indian Child Welfare Association, which he founded, and a link to a recording of today's webinar, and also a link to our feedback survey. You can also access the recording on our YouTube channel, the Brazelton Touchpoints Facebook page, and on the brazeltontouchpoints.org website. If you would like to receive a certificate of attendance, please do be sure to complete the feedback survey that you'll find on that link that will be in the email you should get from us tomorrow. Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsor, the Burke Foundation, and our Brazelton Touchpoint Center production team, Kayla Savelli, Ashley Gaddis, Michael Accardi, and Suzanne Okasik. And now I'd like to introduce today's guest, Terry Cross. Terry Cross is an enrolled member of the Seneca Nation and received his master's degree in social work from Portland State University in Portland, Oregon. He is the founding executive director of NICWA, the National Indian Child Welfare Association, and now serves as a senior advisor. He is the author of Positive Indian Parenting, an Indigenous Parenting Curriculum and Training Program, and he co-authored Towards a Culturally Competent System of Care, published by Georgetown University. Terry has 47 years of experience in child welfare, including 10 years of direct practice. Thank you so much, Terry, for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me and for the opportunity to talk with everyone today about the relational worldview. I want to start out, I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides to share with you. Also, we'll say just a little bit about my presentation style that has evolved this year on this electronic virtual media. So you see the slides at the moment are in sorter view. You'll see 4 slides in front of you. I will start out in the presentation mode, but about every half dozen slides or thereabouts, I will stop and we will have a few comments and questions along the way. So let's go ahead and get started. Our objective today is to look at the intersection between worldviews and the specifically Western thought and the relational worldview model of indigenous populations, not just from North America, but from around the world. I will also be talking about these things as if they are very, very different, when in fact there are many similarities or areas of crossover that we're going to talk about. And many more peoples around the world share this relational worldview. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as well. In order to ground this conversation at its beginning, I need, for this indigenous point of view, I need to ground it in the history of colonialism. And for any colonial power to succeed in controlling the indigenous population of the areas that they're acquiring, they have to control the land, so they have to take territory. And to be successful, the colonial power has to control the natural resources, particularly food, water, and energy. The colonial power has to take this sovereignty, disrupt the leadership and the governance of the indigenous population. And one of the most insidious things, I believe, is they have to take away the legitimacy of thought. To tell the indigenous population that their way of knowing is inferior or primitive, not as valuable as the colonial power's way of knowing. So, worldview, which we are going to be talking about today, is central in this equation. We're going to learn about why. So the legitimacy of thought includes everything from worldview, language, spirituality, healing. And finally, in order for that colonial power to succeed, the colonial power has to take away the children. And this has happened in every instance of colonialism around the world, because taking of children so disrupts the social fabric of an indigenous society that it's hard to recover, and it's hard to sustain a culture from generation to generation when children are removed. So what is worldview? Well, worldview is the shared thought process of a group of people. We all have thoughts and we organize those thoughts into ideas. And our ideas are organized into concepts. And we organize concepts into constructs. And constructs are organized into paradigms. Paradigms then are organized into worldview. So sometimes when I'm asked what worldview is, I say, well, think of it as the big idea. If somebody asks you, hey, what's the big idea? You can say worldview. And I want to compare and contrast the Western approach, the Western European American thought, particularly in helping in education, with indigenous thought. So let's start with the linear worldview that's predominant in the Western European society, and it is the manner of organizing thought and constructs, concept, all along a line. And it is a line that is extremely dependent on cause and effect thinking, and results in our ways of thinking about helping people in a theory of change that's linear. And um, my my colleagues who work a lot in crafting theories of change, I ask for their forgiveness for oversimplifying these concepts, but basically a linear theory of change is given a situation, if we do something in particular, then we're looking for a particular outcome. So given this, if we do this, then this will happen. Now, um, anybody who's written a grant proposal has probably had to develop a theory of change based on this notion. This worldview values facts, measuring things, knowledge, and particularly new knowledge. It values timelines and clock time, punctuality. It values a scientific method. It values materialism and wealth, authority and hierarchy, and independence. Independence that goes hand in hand with individuality. It values direct communication as well as written language, steps and stages, working to make a living, and compartmentalizing. In other words, using a reductionist approach, looking at things in their smallest components in order to understand them. And we're going to look more at this in a moment. And this linear model values credentials. So, evidence of knowledge. So, I'm going to stop there just for a moment, see if there are any thoughts or questions about how how I've depicted this linear, and again, I've grossly oversimplified it for the sake of discussion. So, Josh, anything in the chat box or the questions?
Let's see. There was a comment already saying that a state trainer of early childhood coaches who works with educators, this person's been thinking a lot about how to reinforce the legitimacy of thought and how to honor the worldview of the diverse population that this person serves. Perhaps you say a little bit about how you would go about doing that.
Oh, that's a great question, and I'm going to come to that later. My most important strategy is to help people from indigenous cultures reject the colonial lie, and that's why I started out, because I'm when I talk about the relational model, I'm going to grossly oversimplify it, similarly to having just grossly oversimplified the linear model. Um, the notion that one is less than the other is a social construction based in colonialism. There's simply two different ways of understanding the world. But we have been so convinced by that mainstream society, that colonial society, that the relational model is primitive, that we tend to discount it even in our own belief systems. And when you are a relational thinker in a linear world and you're trying to get through higher education, it's almost guaranteed you're going to feel like a fish out of water. And so it's extremely difficult to succeed in the Western higher education model without learning how to bridge these two things. And you've probably heard the term code switching. And so this is code switching big time. You really have to switch between worldviews if you're going to be successful in that linear world of higher education.
Before you go on, since I know you can't track the chat at the same time, I just want to give you a flavor. Couple of comments. credentials don't equal evidence of knowledge in my experience. And then there's a smile face. And then there's another one that says this type of linear thinking seems like it's everywhere, especially in our schools. So I think people are kind of right there with you, Terry.
Yeah, and boy, you're right about the comment about uh, knowledge isn't necessarily equate with credentials. We we struggle. We can in our tribal communities we may have a medicine person or a healer who's had decades of experience practicing teachings that are thousands of years old, and you can't bill for their services, but you can bill for the brand new PhD that just came to the reservation and knows nothing about our people. So but here's a situation where structurally one worldview is privileged over another worldview. So we'll look more at that. So culture matters in all of this, and culture is the origin of worldview. So let's look at the indigenous worldview of native or tribal thought, and it is understands the world not as a uh, cause and set of cause and effect relationships along a line, but actually a balance, a holistic balance between mind, body, spirit, and context. Now, I we've drawn this at NICWA as a composite of many different tribal teachings. So this is not intended to represent any one particular tribe. We've simply taken the teachings of peoples across Turtle Island and came up with a composite that helps us understand social work, human development, community development. I'm going to talk about all of those aspects. So this is in this worldview, it is fluid, it is cyclical, and it comes in established patterns. Every aspect of life is related to every other aspect. In other words, nothing in any one of those quadrants can change without everything else being impacted. I'm not the same person at 7 o'clock in the morning as I am at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. uh, my context is different. The attention that my brain is paying to a task, different tasks will change. So, and these quadrants can be changed and influenced intentionally over time to change balance, or it can simply happen to us, and we call that homeostasis. The services that we provide don't have to be aimed at the problem. So we don't need a diagnosis. We simply need a process to help restore balance. Interventions may not be directed at the symptoms, but simply to answer the question, how do we bring about balance? So what can we do in one or more quadrants, and usually multiple quadrants, to bring about that change? So let's look at some of the items that might fit. And as I put these up, I want to tell you that they are simply representative examples of what might be in these quadrants. They're because the circle is holistic and represents every aspect of life, every aspect of our human experience and our human behavior. So you can see all of the things that come into play as my examples. I will say a little bit about the spirit quadrant, because in mainstream society, because of the linear process, the spirit quadrant gets associated with religion. And in this model, religion actually exists in all four quadrants. And so the spirit quadrant is about the spiritual nature of our human experience. And what sets the relational model apart from the linear, I think, in one of the most profound ways, is the constant and pervasive influence of the spiritual nature of our existence. So um, we we talk about the innate positive, the innate negative, the learned positive, and the learned negative. So the learned positive are those spiritual activities or for things that we learn to do that evoke positive spiritual outcomes. Prayer, ceremony, ritual. The learned negatives are those things that we learn to do that mess us up spiritually. And they usually appear in religions as the things we shouldn't do, the taboos, the thou shalt not list. So covetousness, jealousy, gossip. These are all, we have a saying in our tribal communities, what goes around comes around. If you put out bad things about people, if you talk badly about people, it'll come back to hurt you. Um, the innate positive are those spiritual forces that help us no matter what it is that we believe or do, and they're understood very differently in different cultures. So it might be good luck and good fortune in one culture, or positive karma in another, or ancestral intervention, or grace, or the Christ-like. In the innate negative, simply the flip side of that, the things that bother us, no matter what it is that we do. And we understand that those forces are operating continually, interacting with the other four quadrants. So our social history is there, our economics, our culture, community, all balanced with our thought process and our emotions and our memories and what's going on in our biochemistry, how we're feeling at the moment. Um, these things, this worldview is associated with a different set of values. So the relational values, principles, and values, it values patterns and cycles. It values wisdom more than knowledge. And um, wisdom, I believe, is knowledge in context. So knowledge for knowledge's sake is not valuable. Knowledge in context does have value. We time is valued for things in their own time. In other words, the cycles, the patterns have their own time frame. Um, and as Indigenous people, if we don't fish when the fish are running, we don't eat. If we don't pick berries when the berries are ripe, the birds will feast. So we do know about time, but we put that time in the context of the cycles. Our scientific method is intergenerational observation. We value generosity and gifting more highly than acquiring wealth, interdependence more than independence, collectivism more than individuality. Autonomy is highly valued because if you if you have collectivism and interdependence without autonomy, you lose personal will. And we value indirect communication and an oral tradition, a storytelling model, uh, cycles and phases rather than steps and stages. Work to live rather than working to make a living. Holistic thinking and experience. So you can compare and contrast the values, and we can see where the conflicts might come between those two worldviews. The theory of change in the relational model is that change is constant, it's inevitable, it's cyclical, and it's a dynamic part of our human experience. It comes in predictable patterns, and it can be facilitated to promote measurable outcomes. In other words, we can influence the relationship amongst the quadrants of the circle in ways that will bring about desired change. The desired outcomes are balance and harmony. And I want to distinguish between those two things. Balance is an adjustment pattern that represents the best or most basic attempt at incorporating stimuli and response. This happens regardless of what we do intentionally. This is a natural process of those four quadrants. Sometimes that balance can be quite troubling. Uh, in an alcoholic family, the family will adjust to the patterns of drinking. They'll find a balance to maintain, but it may not be a healthy balance. uh, a, it, and it is not a sustainable balance. So what we look for is to try to establish a sustainable balance. And harmony is one step beyond. Harmony is where each aspect of life, each of those quadrants, are in complementary relationship with one another. Each uh, we've maximized the balance around the circle. We're applying we're holding our minds in a good way. In my Haudenosaunee teachings, we have a teaching about holding to the good mind. It's a particular discipline, a practice. In holding the good mind means holding your thoughts uh, in such a way that it brings about health and well-being and harmony between people. Our relationships are in harmony with other people and the world around us and our environment. Our bodies, we take care of our bodies in such a way that we're maintaining the balance and we're maintaining a proper relationship with our creator or in our whatever our spiritual understanding is. And so each of those quadrants begins to produce more energy in relationship to one another. And that's when we're seeing the results being referred to as harmony. In uh, my tribal teachings, this is referred to as the good mind. In the plains, it might be the Good Red Road. In Navajo territory, it's the Beauty Way. It's described differently in many different tribes, but it's about acquiring a state of being that's where health and well-being is allows us to have beauty and growth and success, and our capacity for joy is maximized. So I'm going to stop there and once again ask Josh to what's anything in the chat box.
There's so much rich, alive thinking going on in the chat, and we'll save it so you get to see it. And I wish that we had time for you to be able to speak to it all. And I just have to say, Terry, listening to you, you just make everything so clear. It's like the clouds parting and the sun shining, listening to you. And I just wanted to highlight several comments from people who are saying that from they're feeling this resonating, although they don't identify themselves as Indigenous or Native American, or they do. Here's one. African American worldview has a concept of wisdom and common sense versus book learning. I feel a connection to this analysis. Another one is, I do not work with Indigenous populations, but this resonates a lot with some worldview conflicts we have at my job. It is difficult to have the language to encourage people to put aside the white lens. This is giving me more language for that. And then there's one, great information. As a Native and Black educator, we refer to higher education as, in quotes, the academic plantation. I love that. As the white supremacy culture is deep in those spaces. And then there is one from a tribal early Head Start program in Oklahoma saying time is always a hard thing for some of our families. Time for Native people doesn't mean the same. So I wanted to, also sort of give you that very specific comment. And then one last one, just so you can see where people are taking this, and there's so much more. This is wonderful. In the early childhood field, teachers, programs, and even the children are measured, viewed, and valued according to the linear worldview. No wonder I have never seen a tool, in quotes, that really does measure quality in an early childhood program 42 years in the field. So, and that doesn't even begin to do justice to, all of the richness and diversity and the careful thinking that people are doing as they listen to you.
Great, thank you, Josh. Well, I want to jump back in there because in this, one of your commenters really hit it right on that the linear model is privileged, and what we what I believe from an Indigenous point of view is that human behavior is at least as complex as the weather, and our current linear approaches are inadequate to understanding of this complexity. And so the models that we currently have to establish evidence-based practice are really falling far short of what it is that we need to know, and that currently the evidence-based practice is the latest wave of colonial oppression to sweep Native America. And we can't get funding to do things in our own traditional ways. We have to adopt things from mainstream research done in universities or Beltway consulting firms. And this is another example of that, how the privilege of a colonial society can be imposed on an indigenous population or others. And I should also clearly acknowledge that this relational worldview is the predominant worldview in societies across the world that are agriculturally based or closely connected to the land, or have a long history of people being in the same location. So as Native people here in North America, we don't have any corner on the market on the relational model. And even in Europe, before the coming of the scientific age and the Inquisition, when there was much more feminine influence in European thought, the relational model existed strongly in Europe as well. So I want to say that this is something that's shared and across the world in different kinds of ways. So in the relational based approach, a practitioner, whether you're a researcher or a community organizer or a therapist or a social worker, the practitioner enters the flow of the natural forces with purposeful intent. You cannot become part of somebody's world and have a relationship with them without entering the context. Now, as we enter that context, the practitioner examines what's going on in the balance across the four circles, joins with the patterns that are among those quadrants, and begins to influence this and change the state of balance and the degree of harmony. So the unit of study becomes the relationships and the patterns and the cycles. We use this to impact the balance, and we use methods that are designed to impact multiple quadrants. So I know natural helpers are healers. People, one person who was a mentor of mine, um, first of all, would invite you to have a cup of tea, then to sit down and visit, and to have time to calm, uh, have some ritual of beginning, and then probably tell me a story, give me a riddle, or ask me a question that I couldn't answer for maybe a few more visits. Um, so there were intentionally manipulating the balance across the four quadrants. So, and change, even though it's not linear, can be measured by observing, key indicators of balance and harmony across the four quadrants and across time. And as we understand the relationships and changes, we understand that what's happening in the balance across the four quadrants is as important as what's happening in any one of the quadrants. Just a quick example, we did a research project in Canada. It was an evaluation of the First Nations and nonprofit collaboration activity. And in what we found is the collaborations that were sustained were the collaborations where people ate together. Now, if we hadn't asked questions on all four of the quadrants, we never would have never have discovered that relationship and was key to sustaining collaboration, and that it usually happened around people forming the kinds of relationships you form when you eat together. So here's that complexity I was talking about. If we're going to understand human behavior, we have to understand it culturally. We have to understand their behavior individually. We have to understand it in a colonial environment. And we have to understand that each of the intersections are places where dynamics operate. And so the most complex area is where all three and perhaps more of those come together. Now, the word civilized is a social construction. And there is conflict. And so in just a moment, I'm going to talk about how do we reconcile this? How do we bridge these two worldviews? A friend of mine from Canada, who's the executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, Cindy Blackstock, said, as Indigenous people, we believe that our ancestors were mostly right. The Western world seems to believe their ancestors were mostly wrong. As a result, they seem to think that we're inferior. They don't seem to realize that we know what they think of us. It's their privilege to believe that we should be more like them, but it's our privilege to not be. This is the dynamic between the two worldviews, I think, captured in just a brief um, synopsis. Again, Josh, thoughts, comments, questions?
Oh God. um, I'm just so grateful for you being with us and from everybody joining us from around the planet. In the chat there's soul searching and there's revelation and there's transformation. Um, and so I'll bring you one that I am sure you've heard before, which is, let me see if I can find it. There been somewhere. Here it is. I am a Native American. However, I was not raised in a Native way. I envy your in tuneness with your heritage and customs. I want to know more about mine as well.
Mm. Well, it's accessible, and I will share with you that I wasn't raised because my mother was beaten for speaking her language and practicing our traditions. And so she thought by not teaching us as children, she could save us the pain and the trauma of what she experienced in school. My mother only spoke our Seneca language until she was 5 years old. And when she was five, she had to go off to school. And there, she experienced the kind of physical beatings that her family then stopped speaking the Seneca language in their home. It wasn't until I was an adult, like you, I wanted to go home to the reservation and to learn about my culture because I did feel like a fish out of water. When I went home, I started taking language classes, and I went home on a Sunday dinner. I said, "Hey, Mom, I'm learning Seneca." And she said, "Oh, yeah, what are you learning?" I said, "Now, and she looked at me and she said, "¿Qué es este?" And you could have knocked me off my chair with a feather. I said, Mom, I didn't know you could speak the language. She said, I didn't know I could either, but when you said it, I knew what to say back. And we just cried. This is the power of that one privileged way of knowing trying to displace another way of knowing. And so the trauma that the is so deep and so complex that it can last for generations. But it is possible, and as you learn more about these things, you realize that some of what's you've experienced in the world is because that some of this is, we believe, is in your DNA. It is at least learned through social learning. Um, so we're not quite sure of what the transmission is. Let me look. Let me jump back in here and look at how at the intersection here. Um, So, one of the ways that I reconcile these two worldviews is that from an Indigenous point of view, if I'm going to say that that circle is holistic and includes everything, it means that every linear thought has to exist from within the circle. One of our native scholars, Vine Deloria, who's now passed on a decade or more ago, said uh, he used the relational view. He didn't call it that, but he used the relational view to critique a number of Western theories. And what he said was it's at the point where the line crosses the circle that we have the space for dialogue. That every linear thought, every linear process emanates from the center of the circle and crosses the arc of the circle. At that point, we have the opportunity for dialogue. Now, you can look at what we do is we give the teachers and the psychologists the mind, the nurses and the doctors and MDs the body, the clergy, the spirit, and the context we give to the social workers and juvenile justice folks. In each of us will have our own words to diagnose a problem. Each of us will have our own words for helping. We'll be solving the same set of problems with different language and our own linear understanding of what's going on. So, in this relational model, the medical model, even then divides the body up into many, many more small parts here. Again, our best understanding is, if we're coming from a relational model, is to understand um, each of these linear views as intersecting the whole. So it's our opportunity to be holistic and to respect and learn. And I shared that, boy, do I appreciate this. And I want to go back to say that one of these worldviews is not better than the other. There's simply different ways. Each has their strengths, each has their challenges. This challenge of the linear is that it doesn't do a very good job of dealing with side effects. It doesn't it doesn't treat people. It's hard to collaborate. It's hard to have collaborative services. We tend to compartmentalize and and structures get siloed. Funding streams are gone are along each of these different lines, and so it's hard for us to even talk with one another, share information. We have to have releases of information to share around this circle. So those it has its drawbacks, but boy, am I grateful for the the linear process in the development of the vaccine for COVID-19, or uh, not terribly long ago, I had a blood clot in my lung, and boy, was I thankful for the MRI. So each of these ways has value, and we have to learn how to balance those things. And I shared with Josh another time that one of my elders, I struggled with my identity of my indigenous side, and my father is white, and my mom was Seneca, and so I present more white than I do Seneca, and I was just struggling with that identity conflict. And my elder said, what? Yeah, like he asked me, what makes a bridge strong? And it was his way of teaching me, again, a relational way. What makes a bridge strong? I said, I don't know, steel, concrete. He said, a bridge can only be strong if it has a good foundation on both sides. He said, you're a bridge between our culture and the main white culture. He said, you have to have your white man's education is your good foundation on that side. Our teachings, our longhouse ways, our good mind, this is your foundation on our side. Always keep both sides strong and you will be a good bridge. So that allows me to begin to talk about that. So what I do now is I take any Western theory and I filter it through this four quadrant circle. I think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I see that Maslow was talking about a way of organizing the responses to basic human needs, and this is cultural. All of these items that are on this slide are all cultural. And so different cultures have ways to meet basic human needs, but we also have different ways to organize it. Maslow was looking through a male European hierarchical lens when he did this hierarchy. Now, I was trained and taught as a child that if I maintained a proper relationship with the Creator, I would eat. That if I maintained proper relationship with my family, I would eat. With the land, with the creatures, with the plants, I would eat. And then, my dependence is on relationships first, and then I'll be taken care of with food and water and shelter and safety and security. And then my self actualization actually comes through my service and my role with my people. Same theory, organized differently from a different cultural viewpoint. So if I can take Maslow and plot Maslow around the four quadrants, I can say Maslow has value to understanding it from an indigenous point of view. Late in Maslow's life, he's quoted as saying that if he had the hierarchy to do over, he would have added transcendence at the top, moving beyond self-actualization to the spiritual understanding of the human experience. So he even acknowledged that spirit quadrant in a more profound way than in his original work. And a lot of people don't know that he was living and working on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana when he wrote his theory. So let's stop there one more time. I know we're getting short on time, but we're getting close to the end too. Josh, any thoughts or comments about?
There are many, many comments responding to the story you told about going back to learning your language and your conversation with your mother. There are also a lot of comments about the not fitting in, being multiracial. And there was one question about um, why do you feel that so many young people are choosing not to learn their language? I have the hardest time understanding why they wouldn't, since language is such a connection. So I think there's a theme here about feeling disconnected, fish out of water, as you say, not fitting in, and these questions that arise of uh, being multiracial, having multiple identities, and then how that impacts um, attitudes towards learning the language and no doubt being in the culture.
Yeah, if you have never read The Theory of Ethnic and Racial Identity Formation by Atkinson, Morton, and Sue, it's a chapter in one of Daryl Sue's books. Um, and it talks about the challenge of identity formation in a society where one way of being is privileged, and the struggle that um, basically the message of the culture is you should be more like us, but you can't be one of us. and it leaves people in a dilemma of dissonance. We're always bumping up against it's not okay to be us, but when we try to fit in, we can't quite make that, we can't measure up. Um, and it really says an awful lot about why young people turn to things like gangs to satisfy the need to belong when they're caught between cultures where one culture is seen as not quite human, frankly, and the privileged culture is exclusive and doesn't let people in or requires people to give up what they are. So it's and Josh, that's a whole nother workshop we could talk about.
Well, there is a question in the chat about how we can continue learning, and that's another theme where I think there are many people who for whom this is familiar, and for many people for whom this is very eye-opening, who want to go deeper and learn more. So we're gonna have to think about that, Terry, how we're gonna do
Yeah.
that. There's a whole other body of questions which we may not have time to get to, but there's also a lot of mobilization about like what do we do, and
Yeah.
inside of the what do we do, a lot of the questions, comments are about um, the linear approach to what we do, the evidence-based model that then determines funding is a part of a system that drives out relational ways of knowing and being. And there are questions about where do we start to change that. So we can leave that for all of us to think about, or you may have some thoughts you want to share with us now.
Let me share a few quickly. And I first of all let me share. This is a friend of mine. Her Seneca name is Wahayenta. It means she knocks the dew off because she only is tall enough to run through the grass. But she teaches us how to handle the ups and downs of life. She also teaches us how to handle trauma. And she has a black and white necklace, and this necklace was given to her in a ceremony when she went to the was trying to go to the creator to find her face. And it's a representation of the good things that happen to us in our lives and the hard things that happen to our lives, and our job is discernment. And I think this applies to this situation. So NICWA's conducted research to look at what does it mean to be a healthy Native youth, and this happened to be in Portland, Oregon, focus groups with many different groups to establish across the four quadrants what it means to be a healthy Native youth. And we helped the Native American Youth and Family Center incorporate this into a practice model. So we're using, and we're able to get that practice model approved by the state of Oregon as a best practice so they could continue to receive funding even in the face of the legislature passing a law that said the state would only fund evidence-based practices. And we worked with another group, the Native Wellness Institute, to understand what does a healthy Native couple look like. And if we can define what it means to be healthy, and of course, this is different than mainstream because this is a strengths-based approach. What does it mean to be healthy? Then we can begin to measure the things that are indicators of health and wellness. We're not measuring what's wrong with people, we're measuring how they're achieving wellness. So we defined and with the Native Wellness Institute what it means to be a healthy Native couple, and they then use this in their evaluation process their for their healthy relationship curriculum. And we've used this to understand child development. If we take a look at translating what do we need to know about children's well-being, we can help parents understand child development from a holistic point of view. And to begin to embrace the complexity. And what we then need to know is how can we help parents or teachers at preschool level, or I get to do some consulting with teachers in a Native school about how can we promote development in ways that leverage these things. And what we find is that we can leverage things by knowing what are the strengths and challenges around the circle, and begin um, leveraging the things that will bring about more balance, not worrying about what's wrong, but thinking about what's right and what we can build on. In the area of substance abuse, we have a curriculum to understand, and we use this model to do a holistic assessment to help tribal providers do a holistic assessment, because the issue of substance use disorders is extremely complex, and the more we can sort it and use our process to help bring about change, the more likely that, and this is the same circle, but uses it to develop a holistic plan for helping a family with a substance use disorder, and defining that as that nobody starts out being, wanting to be an alcoholic or an addict. I never met anybody who had that goal. And everybody deserves the chance to get out of it. This is a hopeful approach for families. So one last check-in, and I let me jump forward just one more minute. We at NICWA, we also apply this to organizations. We do organizational assessments. We've translated the 4 quadrants into the to apply to organizations, and you can see how we balance the relationship with the environment, with the infrastructure of the organization, which we think of as the mind quadrant, everything you can put on paper, the resource quadrants equivalent to the body, the mission quadrant equivalent to the spirit of the organization, and of course the environment of the context. And we have developed a technical assistance process, and we understand that theory of change as being dependent on a balance across the 4 quadrants. So as an organization, we work with tribes and organizations to help bring their programs back into a balance across the relational worldview as it applies to organizations. Theda Newbreast said, decolonization dismembered our culture and our people and our families. Our job is remembering. Literally, the double entendre here is intentional. We're trying to remember our traditional teachings to help us today. So I will say, he who defines reality holds power, and we're trying to redefine our own reality. So I think with that, Josh, questions, thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that there's one comment. There are a number of comments from people from different places, different cultures that are feeling the connection. One is same in New Zealand, Maori and colonists.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to mention that Linda Tuhiwai Smith book, Decolonizing Methodologies, talks about 25 Indigenous projects, and remembering is one of them, along with reclaiming and retelling the story, and there are many others. There's another one, es maravilloso estar en esta clase, me identifico como latina, en lo importante que es respetar y valorar las culturas. So someone else talking about coming from being Latina, but appreciating the importance of respecting and valuing culture. And here's one. This is a deeply meaningful conversation for me and very relevant to our work in early relational health. We have an Afrocentric worldview for these conversations with family, and the native worldview enriches our understanding, affirms many of our inclinations and our practices. I would love to hear more. And so this is a hard question to talk about in 2 minutes, but it does make me wonder about, are there ways in that we, with our differences and similarities, can work together in solidarity without engaging in cultural expropriation or harvesting, but in ways that truly support those similarities and differences. Because there are lots of people who are appreciating the learning from you from all kinds of different backgrounds.
Yeah, I really think, I've got this slide here about colonization and healing. And it's so important to remember that colonization happened to us. It doesn't define us, even though there's profound and complex continuing trauma. There's nothing wrong with us as people. We're vital human beings. Terrible things happen to, but trauma can be healed, and we know how to heal in our Indigenous societies. But we can't do it alone. Sometimes I'm asked the question, well, why don't you get over it? And my answer to the question is, why don't you stop it? Um, and so we will be able to heal much faster with allies, with people who recognize the vital nature of our Indigenous thought process. Now, that means being partners in community based participatory research. It means we're partnering with Indigenous organizations to empower them to provide the services in their own models. It means that we have opportunity for dialogue and that we partner in writing together, that we publish articles, that we begin to influence and uh, people of color and Indigenous people serving in important roles. I serve on the commission, the Higher Education Coordinating Commission in the state of Oregon, because I want to influence the way that academics think and to be able to embrace a broader way of knowing. So it's a long process, but and boy, do we need allies to know how to do move forward.
Well, I think that turns out to be a good place to thank you once again for being with us. And I think we're going to have to think about how to be together again. And thank you all for joining us today and in the work that we do together. We'll be in touch, Terry.
Okay. All right.
There'll be resources, lots of questions about resources. There'll be for you tomorrow in that email. Thank you, Terry, so much. Thank you.
Thank you all.